In the 15th century, the global economy was dominated by the immense wealth of Spain and Portugal. England, by comparison, was an isolated and poor island sitting on the edge of Europe, desperate for a way to survive. England's initial entry into global expansion was born from a need to capture foreign capital to keep the monarchy afloat. Queen Elizabeth I authorized privateers, essentially state-sponsored pirates, to raid Spanish treasure fleets returning from the Americas. The gold and silver looted from these ships built England's early naval power and funded the royal treasury. England built the foundations of its global power on the authorized theft of wealth from competing empires. England eventually moved from raiding ships to seizing land, beginning with 16th century Ireland. This first modern colonization used a system known as plantations. The plantation model involved systematically importing loyal English and Scottish Protestants to settle on confiscated land. This allowed the English to extract agricultural value from the soil while maintaining military control over a conquered, hostile population. The men who organized the Irish plantations directly used this strategy as the blueprint for the first permanent North American settlements, like Jamestown. The Irish experiment proved that land occupation and resource extraction could be systematized, triggering the empire's expansion across the Atlantic. Britain's early American colonies struggled to produce a profit until the Sugar Revolution turned the Caribbean into the most lucrative territory on Earth. This map shows the triangular trade that fueled that growth. European goods were traded in Africa for enslaved people, who were then shipped to the Americas to work the plantations. The resulting raw sugar was shipped back to Europe. The Royal African Company helped Britain monopolize this trade. Between 1673 and 1683, Britain's share of the slave trade grew from 33% to 74%, with British ships eventually carrying roughly 3.5 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. Profits from slave-produced sugar poured back into Britain, funding the growth of western port cities like Bristol and Liverpool, providing capital for domestic industries. The first British Empire's economic rise was predicated on reducing human beings to extractable capital. In Asia, expansion was driven by a private corporation, the East India Company. It initially sought spices and textiles, operating as a commercial entity rather than a government project. As the Mughal Empire declined, the company moved to fill the power vacuum, violently outmaneuvering Dutch and French rivals to secure trade dominance. At the 1757 Battle of Plassey, the company used its private army of sepoys to conquer Bengal. This gave a group of merchants absolute military, political, and tax control over one of the wealthiest regions in India. For decades, the East India Company functioned as a corporate monopoly, extracting Asian wealth with virtually no oversight from the British government. By the mid-1700s, this private corporation had become one of the most powerful military and political organizations in the world. By the 19th century, the economic center of gravity was shifting from sugar plantations toward domestic factories. Increased global competition had made slave labor less profitable, while Britain's own industrial revolution created a massive new demand for coal, iron, and textiles. This shift toward manufacturing changed the empire's priorities. Parliament abolished slavery in 1833 as the focus moved away from human labor and toward securing new raw materials, like African palm oil and rubber, to feed their growing machines. To secure these resources, European powers met at the 1884 Berlin Conference. They partitioned 90% of Africa among themselves, drawing rigid borders that ignored existing cultural and linguistic realities. Protecting the trade routes for these materials became a strategic obsession. Britain took control of the Suez Canal to shorten the trip to India, ensuring its industrialized supply chain remained unbroken. The empire had evolved into an industrialized machine, carving up entire continents to sustain its domestic factories. After the Indian Rebellion of 1857, the British government dissolved the East India Company and took direct control of India. Queen Victoria was crowned empress, and India became the jewel in the crown. This era marked the peak of the empire. Through expansion into Australia, Africa, and East Asia, Britain became the largest territorial empire in human history. Holding this much territory required a massive permanent military presence. The financial strain of maintaining this global footprint, compounded by 2 world wars, eventually brought the empire to the brink of bankruptcy. The sheer geographic scale required to maximize wealth extraction across the globe eventually made the empire too expensive to sustain. Nationalist resistance movements began fracturing the empire from within. In 1919, Ireland declared independence, marking the start of a wave of anti-colonial uprisings that would soon spread to Africa and Asia. This resistance, combined with Britain's post-war economic exhaustion, led to rapid and widespread decolonization across the globe. The empire left behind a map scarred by borders drawn for resource extraction. These arbitrary lines often grouped rival communities together or split single ethnic groups apart, creating tensions that persist today. While the physical British Empire collapsed, its legacy is immortal. It left behind a global trade network built for its own profit, and a modern map permanently divided by colonial ink. The death of Queen Elizabeth II in 2022 sent immediate geopolitical shockwaves through the Commonwealth. Within days, leaders in the Bahamas and Jamaica moved to begin the formal process of severing their final ties to the monarchy. Elizabeth inherited a system that, at its peak, dominated a quarter of the globe. While her modern image was one of ceremony and diplomacy, the crown she wore represented a centuries-old architecture of power. We see the symptoms of this inheritance everywhere, in the recurring border conflicts across Africa, and in the fact that the United States Navy now patrols the maritime trade routes once guarded by London. This map illustrates the sheer scale of British reach in the early 20th century. Though the empire formally died decades ago, the nations colored pink here find that colonial influence is a difficult machine to switch off. The British Empire functioned as a global operating system, engineered on three distinct pillars: military leveraging, economic extraction, and legal anchors. The modern world still vibrates from the motion of those original gears. The first pillar was military muscle. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, the Royal Navy acted as the ultimate enforcer of global trade, physically preventing European rivals from challenging British dominance in the Atlantic and Pacific. This supremacy faced a sudden crisis in the late 19th century. A newly unified industrial Germany began building its own massive fleet, creating a direct threat to the British homeland. To defend London, the Admiralty began a strategic retreat, recalling warships from the Western Hemisphere to European waters. This created a massive power vacuum. The United States quickly filled the gap, expanding its navy to secure the abandoned trade routes. This fateful triangle between London, Berlin, and Washington effectively ended Britain's ability to police the world's oceans in isolation. By prioritizing the defense of its own core, Britain inadvertently handed the keys of the Western Hemisphere to the United States, proving that infinite imperial expansion eventually creates its own successor. Maintaining a global navy required a constant stream of capital, a need that drove European powers toward the scramble for Africa. At the 1884 Berlin Conference, 14 nations sat down to divide an entire continent. They did not invite a single African leader to the table. These diplomats drew straight lines through the landscape, ignoring cultural and ethnic boundaries. These were not meant to be stable national borders. They were extraction routes designed to funnel raw materials from the interior directly to coastal ports. The human cost was staggering. The demand for rubber drove a system of forced labor and violence that decimated populations across the continent. King Leopold II ran the Congo as his personal private property, a personal business venture rather than a formal national colony, managed solely for maximum profit. By prioritizing immediate siphoning of wealth over internal stability, the architects of this system left behind a framework that remains structurally dependent on resource exports. While ships and money provide temporary control, the empire used a third pillar to ensure that influence survived the end of physical occupation: the law. This door in London leads to the highest court of appeal for several independent nations. Even decades after independence, legal decisions for these countries are still finalized by a council physically located thousands of miles away in the UK. Severing this tie is a legal minefield. Many former colonies have constitutions containing poison pills, referendum requirements so steep that nations like Jamaica remain trapped in a state of legal limbo. The modern royal family provides a diplomatic face for this system, exercising practical leverage by signing off on the ambassadors and diplomats who represent these former colonies to the rest of the world. The empire engineered subservience into the legal code of its colonies, ensuring that its influence survived without the need for a single occupying soldier. World War II finally pushed the imperial machine past its limit. Britain finished the war financially drained and militarily exhausted, unable to sustain its global reach. This exhaustion, combined with massive anti-colonial movements like the one led by Mahatma Gandhi, caused Britain's global grip to fracture. In 1945, the formal end of the British century was signaled not in London, but at a surrender ceremony in a French schoolhouse. The officer overseeing that surrender was an American, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, solidifying the arrival of a new global hegemon. British troops withdrew, and the Union Jack was lowered, but the artificial borders, extractive economic frameworks, and foreign legal anchors remained. A new flag doesn't erase a centuries-old operating system. Real decolonization is the generational work of dismantling these invisible structures.